I knew something was wrong the second I turned onto the dirt road leading to my cabin. My tires rolled slowly over gravel, and the tall pine trees that lined the road swayed quietly in the morning wind. Usually the place felt peaceful, but that morning, something looked very different. About 30 yards ahead of my cabin, right across my driveway, sat a bright yellow metal barrier, and in front of it were 2 rows of steel spike strips, the kind police use to stop fleeing cars. For a moment, I honestly thought I had driven into the wrong property. But no, that was definitely my driveway, and someone had just installed road spikes across it. I stopped the truck and got out. A brand new wooden sign hung from the barrier. In big red letters it read, HOA Community Property, Unauthorized Access Prohibited. I stared at the sign, then I stared at the spikes. Then I looked at my cabin sitting peacefully another 100 feet down the driveway. And that's when I noticed something else. A fresh line of orange spray paint running through the grass, right through the middle of my yard. There was only one person who could possibly be responsible for this. My neighbor, Greg. Greg had moved into the house next to my property about 3 months earlier. He was the kind of guy who introduced himself by listing HOA rules. The first conversation we ever had went like this. You know, this area technically falls under HOA jurisdiction. I laughed when he said it, because my cabin was built long before the HOA ever existed, and it was not part of the neighborhood. But Greg didn't seem to like that answer. Over the next few weeks, Greg became strangely obsessed with my property. He would stand near the tree line sometimes, staring at the cabin like he was studying it. Once he even asked me if I had the updated HOA property map. I told him again, "My land isn't part of your HOA." He nodded like he heard me, but his expression said something else, like he believed I just hadn't figured it out yet. Right on cue, Greg appeared. He walked confidently down the road from his house carrying a clipboard. And when he saw me standing near the spikes, he smiled. "Morning?" I pointed at the barrier. "What is this?" Greg glanced proudly at the setup. "That's the new HOA boundary control point." I blinked. "The what?" Greg tapped his clipboard like a manager explaining policy. "After reviewing the property layout, I determined your cabin driveway actually crosses HOA land." I stared at him. "You determined that?" He nodded. "Yes. So until the situation is resolved, access is restricted." Then he pointed down toward the spike strips. "Vehicles that attempt to cross may be subject to damage." Now, I've dealt with difficult neighbors before, but Greg had a very special kind of confidence, the kind people get when they believe a rule book makes them powerful. So I asked a simple question. "Greg, did you actually check the county property records?" He smiled again. "The HOA map is very clear." That was when I realized something important. Greg had never checked the real property records. I pointed toward the spikes. "You realize this is my driveway, right?" Greg shrugged. "That's still under review. So until it's confirmed, we're restricting access." I couldn't help laughing. "You installed tire spikes on land you don't own?" Greg crossed his arms. "We'll see about that." I pulled out my phone. Greg immediately frowned. "Who are you calling?" "The county property office." His smile faded slightly, but he quickly recovered. "That's fine. They'll confirm the HOA boundary." I nodded slowly. "Yeah, they definitely will." Within 10 minutes, I had the county property database open. The official survey map was crystal clear. My driveway, my yard, and the exact spot where Greg had placed the spike strips were all fully inside my property line, not even close. Greg wasn't just wrong, he was about 40 feet wrong. I turned the screen toward him. Greg studied the map for a moment, then shrugged. "That survey could be outdated." Outdated. The map was updated last year. At that moment I realized Greg wasn't interested in facts, he was interested in control. Instead, I simply nodded. "All right, Greg. You do what you think you need to do." Then I walked back to my truck. Greg looked very satisfied with himself, like he had just won some kind of territorial battle. But what he didn't realize was something very important. Installing spike strips on someone else's property isn't just rude, it's very illegal. And within the next 48 hours, Greg's little HOA power trip was about to end very badly for him. After checking the county records, I already knew Greg had made a huge mistake. But I also knew arguing with him wasn't going to fix anything. So instead of debating property lines in the middle of the driveway, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to the county property office to confirm the survey map I had pulled up. The second was to the non-emergency sheriff's line, because installing spike strips on someone else's driveway isn't just a bad neighbor move. It's considered placing a hazardous obstruction on private property, and the sheriff's office takes that pretty seriously. About 40 minutes later, a patrol SUV slowly rolled down the dirt road. Greg was still standing near the barrier when the deputy stepped out. He looked confident, like he was about to prove me wrong. The deputy walked over and looked at the spikes first, then the barrier, then the big red HOA sign. Finally, he turned toward Greg. "Who installed these?" Greg proudly raised his hand. "That would be me." "Do you own this property?" Greg immediately answered. "It belongs to the HOA?" The deputy turned toward me. "Do you have documentation showing ownership?" I handed him my phone with the county survey map. He studied it carefully for about 10 seconds, then zoomed in again. Finally, he looked back at Greg. "You might want to take a look at this." Greg stared at the screen. His confidence slowly started draining from his face, because the property lines were painfully clear. My driveway, my yard, and the exact location of the spike strips. All of it sat deep inside my property. The deputy crossed his arms. "Sir, these spikes are on private land." Greg shook his head. "That survey is wrong." The deputy raised an eyebrow. "The county survey?" Instead of backing down, Greg doubled down. He pointed toward the barrier. "This is HOA jurisdiction. We're enforcing community access control." The deputy looked confused. "You're saying the HOA authorized this?" Greg nodded confidently. "Yes." That was a very unfortunate claim for Greg, because the deputy immediately pulled out his radio. Within a few minutes, the deputy asked for contact information for the HOA board. Greg gave it to him without hesitation. Apparently, he thought the board would back him up. About 15 minutes later, the deputy received a call back, and his expression changed instantly. The deputy ended the call and looked directly at Greg. "The HOA board says they never approved this." Greg blinked. "They... what?" "They said they had no idea you installed anything here." Greg suddenly looked a lot less confident, because now he wasn't just arguing with a neighbor. He was explaining himself to a law enforcement officer. The deputy pointed toward the spikes. "These need to be removed immediately." Greg hesitated. "Well, we'll need to discuss that with the HOA." The deputy cut him off. "No, they're a hazard on private property. They're coming out now." After a long, uncomfortable silence, Greg slowly walked over to the barrier. For the next 20 minutes, Greg quietly removed every spike strip. The deputy stood nearby watching. I leaned against my truck and enjoyed the show. Cars from the HOA neighborhood occasionally drove by, and several residents slowed down to see what was happening. Greg's little boundary control point was being dismantled in front of everyone. Once the spikes were removed, the deputy took a few photos of the area. Then he wrote something in a small notebook. Greg nervously asked, "Is this going to be a problem?" The deputy looked up. "That depends." "On what?" "On whether the property owner decides to press charges for obstruction and property hazard." Greg slowly turned toward me. Now I could have pressed charges, and honestly, Greg probably deserved it. But something told me the situation was about to get even worse for him without my help. So I simply shrugged. "I just want my driveway clear." The deputy nodded. "That's reasonable." But before he left, he turned back toward Greg one last time. You may also want to talk to your HOA board. That evening, Greg's house looked unusually busy. Several cars from the HOA board were parked outside. Lights stayed on late into the night. Apparently, the board had a lot of questions. Questions like, why had Greg claimed HOA authority? Why had he installed hazards on property the HOA didn't own? And why had he involved law enforcement in a situation the HOA knew nothing about? The next day, Greg avoided eye contact whenever I saw him, but the real surprise came the following afternoon. A moving truck pulled into Greg's driveway. At first, I assumed he was just bringing in furniture, but then I noticed something strange. They weren't unloading boxes, they were loading them. And standing near the front door were two HOA board members watching the entire process. Later that evening, one of my other neighbors walked over and quietly explained the situation. Apparently, Greg had seriously misrepresented himself to the HOA board. He wasn't authorized to enforce rules. He wasn't part of the management committee. And the stunt with the spike strips had created legal liability for the entire HOA, so the board made a decision, and it happened very quickly. Less than 48 hours after installing those spikes, Greg received an official notice. Not just a warning, not just a fine, an eviction order from the HOA managed property. His lease was terminated for creating legal risk and unauthorized enforcement actions. By the end of the week, Greg was gone. The barrier disappeared. The spikes never returned. And my quiet little cabin went back to being peaceful again. But the HOA learned a valuable lesson from the entire mess. Because sometimes, the biggest neighborhood problems aren't caused by the rules. They're caused by people who think they're in charge of them. Subscribe my YouTube channel for more HOA interesting videos.